Welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burgess-Watson. Coming up in our program, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres strongly condemns the attack that killed 6 UN employees. We'll be speaking to a Hamas-Israeli negotiator about how a ceasefire could be reached. We'll be getting reaction to those airstrikes with the former Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem and Special Envoy for the Foreign Ministry, Fleur, Hassan-Nahoum, and also from the Palestinian ambassador to Denmark, Manuel, Hassassian. And as the dust settles from Tuesday night's presidential debate, we'll ask, what are the press, the pundits and the public saying about who came out stronger? Welcome. We're going to start with Gaza, where many people are coming to terms with the deaths of at least 18 people following on from an Israeli airstrike on Wednesday, which hit a school in the Nusayrat refugee camp. Amongst the dead, 6 employees of the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA. Well, the Israeli military has defended the strike, claiming it was aimed at terrorists, and they insist that they took all the necessary precautions. However, the fallout from this attack paints a grim picture of what has become a lost generation in Gaza. Meanwhile, tensions continue to rise on the West Bank, adding further complexity to an already volatile situation. Well, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has strongly condemned the attack, labeling Israel's military actions in Gaza as unprecedented during his time as UN chief.
In the case of Gaza, let's be clear, we must condemn firmly what was the horrible terror attacks that Hamas has produced. But then afterwards, we have witnessed a series of military interventions by Israel in Gaza with a level of death and destruction that has no parallel in my time as Secretary General, and with very dramatic violations of international humanitarian law and total absence of an effective protection of civilians. The Hamas also committed several violations of international humanitarian law, and there is the absolutely horrendous question of the hostages. But it is clear that what's happening in Gaza is totally unacceptable.
The UN Secretary-General speaking there. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by the Middle East Director of the International Communities Organization, the ICO, who's also a long-time back-channel negotiator with Hamas and has worked with various Israeli prime ministers. Gershon Baskin, a very warm welcome to Al Arabiya News. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. First of all, the UN Chief Antonio Guterres, we just heard him there, condemning that attack at Nusayrat. He called it totally unacceptable. What's your understanding of what exactly happened at the Al-Jawni school there in Gaza?
Look, I think it's important for everyone to note, and I think everyone knows this already, that on October 7th, Hamas crossed moral red lines that should never be crossed. And since October 7th, Israel has been crossing all kinds of moral red lines that shouldn't be crossed. The Israeli attack in Nusayrat is based on the continued premise of Israel that military pressure will lead to the freeing of the hostages. We saw a week and a half ago an Israeli rescue attempt of hostages that led to their execution. So I believe that the Israeli army is being a lot more cautious now about not engaging in those rescue missions, but they are still pounding Gaza with bombs, attacking Hamas fighters, and not releasing any pressure on Hamas in order to help release the hostages. This, unfortunately, is leading to the killing of many innocent Palestinians and, of course, the killing of Israeli hostages as well.
So you're basically saying that the current strategy of Israel, at least when it comes to the releasing of the hostages, simply isn't working.
Well, that's for sure. We're in 11 months of this war, and 8 Israeli hostages have been returned alive through rescue operations. There are still 101 hostages in Gaza. We don't know how many of them are alive. This strategy is not working. They can only be brought home through an agreement with Hamas. But Israel is very reluctant to make an agreement with Hamas because it will be perceived as a Hamas victory. And Prime Minister Netanyahu continues to talk about the false hopes of a total victory over Hamas.
There's a Hamas delegation in Doha right now. Negotiations obviously have been going on for months. What sort of an impact could an attack like that one at Nusayrat have on the dialogue?
I don't think it has much of an impact. There are already between 40 and 50,000 dead Palestinians in Gaza, the majority of them civilians. It's not clear how much Hamas really cares about the civilian deaths. Some of their leaders have talked about the sacrifices that the Palestinian people need to make in order to achieve liberation, and they have this distorted Islamic theology of sanctifying death and becoming a martyr. So I'm not sure it impacts the talks. My bottom line on the talks is that they've been continuing for 3 months and they are essentially negotiating a bad deal. They're negotiating a deal that doesn't put an immediate end to the war and Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, nor does it release all the Israeli hostages at once. And that's what needs to be achieved in negotiations. We need to end this war. We need to get Israel out of Gaza. We need to return the Israeli hostages home. That's what needs to be negotiated on. And unfortunately, that's not what's being negotiated at the present time.
I mean, just going back to the talks themselves, we heard from Hamas that they've made a new offer, they say, with no conditions, to respect the framework that was put forward by President Joe Biden back in May. What's your reading of that offer?
Well, and Hamas is trying to say that Israel is responsible for blocking the agreement, while the Israelis are saying Hamas is responsible. In fact, the bottom line is really this, that this is not a good agreement. They're talking about a 6-week first stage ceasefire in which time 32 hostages will be returned to Israel. Israel will redeploy out of populated areas. By the way, I don't know what unpopulated areas of Gaza look like. There are no unpopulated areas of Gaza. And then we don't know what happens in the second 6-week period that's supposed to begin after the first 6 weeks. It's not determined. They say negotiations will continue. Israel says that they will renew the war, and Hamas is saying quite clearly that they will not make an agreement that does not put an end to the war. So we're kind of stuck on this ongoing negotiation. I understand that there are two main issues that are left to be determined. One is the Philadelphia corridor, the border between Gaza and Egypt that Israel demands to keep a military presence on. And the second issue concerns the release of Palestinian prisoners from Israeli prisons, where Israel is demanding a veto, I believe, on 65 names of prisoners that Hamas would like to release from those serving life sentences for killing Israelis. Those two issues are not resolved. I think that the Americans, the Qataris, and the Egyptians are trying to resolve them. Last night, the talks were between the Hamas delegation and the Qatari prime minister and the minister of Mukhabarat, the minister of intelligence from Egypt. But still, the talks seem to not be reaching their conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, it's been 11 months, getting on for a year of talks. I mean, what is there to show for the diplomacy and the diplomatic efforts of these last 11 months?
Very little, in fact. It shows a lot of effort on the part of the mediators and reluctance on the part of the two antagonists. As an Israeli, I point to the government of Israel, who has the responsibility to return the hostages home. And it seems quite evident to many of us in Israel that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not interested in making a deal, is not interested in ending the war. He wants to prolong the war in order to prolong his own political position as the Prime Minister of Israel. And that seems to be where we're stuck here in Israel, at least from the Israeli point of view. And I think this is the overriding view of the majority of Israelis who want a deal now to bring the hostages home, even at the cost of ending the war and a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza.
So as you say, I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu under intense domestic pressure, intense international pressure, and yet you say not interested in striking a deal. Why?
Well, Netanyahu understands that when this war ends, we are probably going to head to new elections, that he will not be elected prime minister. He will be forced to establish the National Commission of Inquiry to determine what happened on October 7th, what led up to October 7th, and the dysfunctional nature of his government since October 7th. And he is the head of the government. He cannot escape responsibility. He's the longest serving prime minister in Israel. He has been in office almost completely the full time since 2009. He's responsible for the policies that empowered Hamas and weakened the Palestinian Authority and delegitimized any possibility of an Israeli-Palestinian peace based on the two-state solution. He has to pay for that. He will go down in history as the worst leader that the Jewish people have ever had, and he knows that. So he's trying to have his ultimate victory, to have the head of Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader in Gaza, and to say that we defeated Hamas once and for all.
I mean, even before October the 7th, Israeli society was deeply divided. There were huge protests on the streets on a pretty regular basis. I'm just curious as to whether or not Benjamin Netanyahu is feeling more pressure now than perhaps at any time since October the 7th, not least with the deaths of those hostages announced just a couple of days ago.
My assessment is, I believe, is that he is very detached from the reality of the Israeli people today. He's surrounded by yes men who tell him what he wants to hear. He doesn't hear the opinion of the people in the street. He boxes himself in cages. You would not believe the amount of police that surround his home in Jerusalem when there are demonstrations now almost every night against him. He never sees it, he never meets it, he never hears it. He's protected in a kind of cocoon that keeps him isolated and detached from the people. He organizes press conferences, which are not really press conferences. He organizes photoshops with people who support him. And he believes that his base, which is pretty solid, it's around 25 to 30% of the public, will keep him in office forever. But that's not the reality of Israel today.
He was probably watching the US presidential debate on Tuesday night, as millions of other people were. What do you think his reading is of how events in Washington could unfold, and therefore what sort of impact that might have on his policy with regards to the war in Gaza?
Well, I think Benjamin Netanyahu is clearly a supporter of Donald Trump, and Donald Trump failed in this debate to impress the American people or the people of the world that he would be the next president of the United States. Whereas Kamala Harris not only won the debate, knockout, she also spoke the magic words of freedom and liberation for the Palestinian people and self-determination, which is the code word for a Palestinian state. And while American presidents have talked about the two-state solution, I think this was the most explicit comment by a candidate for the United States presidency of the Palestinian state that needs to be established next to Israel in order to protect Israel in the region and enable Israel to live in peace with the entire region. I think we all know that in order to defeat Hamas and the extremists in Israel, we need to make the two-state solution real. And it seems that Kamala Harris is much more intent on making that happen if she becomes president of the United States. And that must worry Netanyahu a lot because he's done everything in his power to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state next to Israel since 2009.
And in her capacity as vice president, what sort of gestures have we seen from Kamala Harris? What struck you with regards to what she's said and done, or not said and not done, when it comes to this issue of the war in Gaza?
Right. Well, I don't think she's had very much impact. We've seen President Biden being the president who's supported Israel more than any president in the history of the relationship between Israel and the United States. And of course, the United States has been fueling the war in Gaza nonstop, which certainly doesn't improve the standing of the United States in the entire Middle East. And as vice president, she has not played a dominant role other than making speeches about supporting Israel's right to defend itself, which she did in the debate as well. But I think as a candidate for president, she's freer to go beyond the traditional US positions. And hopefully, if and when she does become president of the United States, she will lead our region into a new peace process that will be based in the region, where we talk about a new architecture for regional security, stability, economic development, dealing with climate change, and it will involve all the countries in the region, including Saudi Arabia, in this mix once we're on the path to creating a real two-state solution.
But just going back to what you were saying a minute ago about how Benjamin Netanyahu lives in something of a cocoon where he's detached from perhaps the reality of what's happening on the streets, is he detached as well from what's being said in the corridors of power in places like Washington, where it really does matter for him? And what do you think Kamala Harris, or whoever the next president of the United States, Donald Trump, could or might say to him, to Benjamin Netanyahu, to make him listen and make him perhaps come to the negotiating table, or at least do something towards bringing about a conclusion to that 11-month-long war?
Right. Well, we don't really know what's said behind closed doors, but what we do see is what's in the open. And we saw Benjamin Netanyahu received in the U.S. Congress and the U.S. Capitol by the members of the US government and the Congress. Netanyahu has this impression that the American people are behind him and behind Israel in his war against Iran and radical Islam and against Hamas. I'm not sure that he perceives the United States as not supporting him and his policies. Again, we don't know what's said behind closed doors, but we should also recognize that the United States wields an enormous amount of power vis-a-vis Israel that's apparently not used. The US diplomatic toolbox with regard to Israel is not filled with the carrots of the billions of dollars that it gives to the state of Israel in weapons and financial support, but it's also political support, which are carrots and sticks. It's the US veto in the Security Council. It's the rearming of Israel that enables it to drop more bombs on Gaza. I think the United States should tell Israel that with regard to a possible attack by Iran or by Hezbollah, the United States has your back. But we will no longer support this war in Gaza. We want it to end. And I think the United States could be a lot more forceful with regard to Israel having to end the war. There should not be a question here. Too many innocent people have died. Too much destruction has happened. Too much threat to the security of the region and the world is there because of this conflict. And the United States needs to use its power, whether it's Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, the next president of the United States. It should not be tolerated to enable Israel and the Palestinians to continue to endanger the security of the world.
Gershon, we're almost out of time. Just before I let you go, just very briefly, could you tell us a tiny bit about what you do in your capacity as a negotiator, a back-channel negotiator? Because I gather you're in this privileged position of having dialogue with all parties here, including with Hamas. Just tell us a tiny bit about that.
Right, well, very briefly, I was approached by families of hostages who asked me to see if I could find a better way to negotiate with Hamas and find a better deal. And I asked leaders in Hamas if they were willing to make a deal which would end the war in 3 weeks. Israel would withdraw from Gaza. They would release 101 of the Israeli hostages that they hold, and there would be an agreed upon release of Palestinian prisoners from the Israeli prisons. And the answer I got was positive. I transmitted this to the Qataris and the Egyptians and the Americans, and then I went public with it last week, and I was in the news every day in Israel and around the world. And now it's really in the hands of the decision makers and the officials to see if they can pick this up. My talks with Hamas over the last days have reconfirmed that they would support this plan, this proposal. They're not coming out with it, which disappoints me greatly. I think they should. I think they should announce it. But they also have their relationships with the Qataris and the Egyptians, and they don't want to change course in the middle that the Egyptians and the Americans and the Qataris are working so hard on. But this is the position that they seem willing to accept. I have transmitted this to a number of very influential Israelis, and we're trying to see how we can impose this on the Israeli prime minister and on the Israeli body politic to know that there is an option to end the war in 3 weeks and bring all the Israeli hostages home.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Really appreciate that. Fascinating insights there. Gershon Baskin, the Middle East Director of the International Communities Organization. Thank you very much indeed. Let's go into more detail and find out where we are with regards to the diplomatic efforts to bring about an end to the war in Gaza. Joining us now is the former Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem and Special Envoy for the Foreign Ministry in Israel, Fleur Hassan-Nahoum. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. We're also joined by the Palestinian ambassador to Denmark, Manuel Hassassian. Thank you so much to you as well for joining us, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Hamas has a delegation in Doha right now. They're talking about the ceasefire and hostage release deal that's been talked about for several months. I'd like to find out what's new and where we are with regards to the talks right now. Ambassador, let me start with you. What's your understanding?
Well, my understanding is basically that there has been a lot of procrastination by the Israeli side, especially Netanyahu, who is not willing basically to go ahead with this deal for the simple fact that he wants to perpetuate, this conflict further and further by creating new facts on the ground and by trying basically to reach an agreement after the US elections, where he assumes that maybe Trump will win the elections and that will be on his side. And by the procrastination process, he's trying to remain in power as much as he can. So we know from our, sources that almost 90% of the deal has been agreed upon by both parties, and that there are certain, things that are not still quite clear. The Americans are trying to put some efforts in trying, to mend the differences, let alone our Arab interlocutors that are striving basically to reach, a certain kind of a deal between the two parties, so as, the pain and the suffering of the Palestinian people will stop. And we're pushing for this ceasefire because from a humanitarian perspective and from the detriments of this genocide on our innocent people, is something that is abhorrent and should be stopped, where the international community also is putting a lot of pressure on Israel to accept the deal, let alone, the relatives of the hostages are also putting pressures inside Israel by demonstrating every day, against Netanyahu. And it seems nothing is being budged by Netanyahu really to make this deal happen.
Okay, Fleur, I have to turn to you. Fleur Hassan-Nahoum in Jerusalem. How much of what Ambassador Hassassian just said there would you say you agreed with?
Well, very little. Let's start with this. On October 6th, we had a ceasefire with Hamas from the previous war. Israel left the Gaza Strip in 2005. Along the way, when Hamas took over in a brutal coup, killed a lot of Ambassador Hassassian's friends from the Palestinian Authority, from Fatah, and have been a brutal dictatorship to their people, instead of spending all of the aid that the world has given them, creating a terror base around 700 kilometers of terror tunnels around their country and very little opportunity for their people. So let's start with who's to blame for this whole thing to begin with. Now, we have on the 7th October, a horrible, horrible massacre that takes 250 hostages, including little children. There's still 2 little babies left in Gaza. We have zero proof of life for anybody. And we have an execution, a brutal execution of 6 hostages only a week ago. Now, since January, Hamas has been offered 5 different ceasefire deals. And even Secretary Blinken has said that the onus has always been on Hamas, and Hamas have been the party that has not accepted very generous deals from Israel. Now, in the last few weeks, there was another deal on the table that Netanyahu insisted included Israel staying on the Philadelphia corridor, because that is where all the arms that killed 1,200 people in that massacre, the arms that are used to not just subjugate their own population, but throw rockets at Israel, those arms are all coming through these Egyptian tunnels. Are there ways around it? I want to believe so. I really believe that we have to do everything in our power to bring those hostages home. It is crucial, not just because those families are waiting for those innocent people to come home, but because it has to be something that Israel takes responsibility for, to bring our hostages home. So I pray, like with every Israeli, that this deal goes through and that Hamas, it's not the Israeli government, it's Hamas that is stopping it, because ultimately we are negotiating with terrorists.
And Fleur, I just want to pick up on one of the points that Ambassador Hassassian made just there with regards to Prime Minister Netanyahu, in a way, procrastinating because it's in his political interests and the interest of his political survival to do so. And that was an issue that was picked up on just before we crossed to you by Gershon Baskin, who is the Middle East Director for the International Communities Organization. How do you respond to that particular charge, Fleur?
Look, I want to believe that the leaders of our country are doing the best for our countries. If he has political considerations, I don't know. I can't speak for Netanyahu, but I can tell you that the people in the government that I know, the hostage negotiators that I've been speaking to, the military leaders that I've been speaking to, everybody's doing everything in their power to bring those hostages home. And I pray to God. Listen, ultimately, Hamas has brought this on its own people. This is not a war Israel wanted. It's not a war Israel started. We left the Gaza Strip in 2005 with the hope that this may be the pilot to a future Palestinian state. And look what they did with it. They could have built Dubai, and look what they built with that. That is not Israel's fault. And I think the problem of this conflict is that, unfortunately, the Palestinian leadership, be it the PA, Fatah, or Hamas have never actually gone through any type of introspection or taken responsibility or agency for anything and every peace deal that they've ever rejected.
Ambassador Hassassian, I have to allow you to respond to those comments.
Yes, first of all, this conflict, which I consider to be an epistemic conflict, did not start on October 7th. It started since 1948, and we have been living under occupation, and we have the right to resist this occupation. We had the Oslo Agreement, which turned out to be a dismal failure, because the United States was not an honest broker of peace, and this is the end result of it. Building more settlements, trying, yes, Israel withdrew in 2005 from Gaza, but Israel besieged Gaza for the last 17 years by land, air, and sea. And the conflict today is a breach with Egypt on the Philadelphia Control, which Netanyahu is insisting that he has to stay there and occupy it and what have you. So I believe that what your guest is saying is looking at the glass as half empty and not as half full, for the simple fact that she is putting the onus on the Palestinian Authority that has been so far, dubbed as a traitor because of its collaborative on security matters with Israel. And now they are trying basically to attack, the West Bank through the settlers with the IDF, trying to protect them. The end result of this is that, Israel that wants the geography and not the demography of the Palestinians. And you have seen many of the Palestinians have been incarcerated, killed, now more than 700 in the West Bank. And, Jenin has been bulldozed, Tubas has been bulldozed. And the continuation of this aggression and onslaught on the Palestinian people on the West Bank, let alone East Jerusalem and Gaza, is a clear message from this extreme government in Israel that they don't want a peace deal, they don't want a two-state solution, they just want to have the land without the people.
Fleur, what is your response to that? And I know from looking at your Twitter feed that perhaps you'll disagree with that comment that what happened on October the 7th was an event in isolation.
Well, I think he's right about one thing. The source of the problem is 1948, and this is really the crux of the conflict that nobody wants to face. You see, the conflict exists not because there isn't a Palestinian state. The conflict exists because there's a Jewish state that the Palestinian leadership have never accepted. And this is why they've rejected 5 different offers for a two-state solution, because their interest has never been to build a state. You wouldn't even know what it would look like, that state. They can't even build state institutions because the focus has always been in destroying the state of Israel. So it doesn't matter what land compromises you give. In 1947, there was a two-state solution offered. They said no. In Oslo, there was a two-state solution offered. They said no. In 2001 again, with 3/4 of the old city, my city here in Jerusalem, offered to Arafat. He said no and started a bloody intifada. And then we left Gaza in 2005. And in 2009, Ehud Olmert also offered an even more generous deal. So the question is, why do they keep saying no? And so we can't really think anymore that this conflict is about land. This conflict is not about land. This conflict is about ideology. This conflict is about the fact that the Palestinian leadership, and they have henceforth brainwashed their people. They don't teach them in schools that one day we're going to have a peaceful two-state solutions. No, they teach children in schools that one day everybody's going to have the right of return from the river to the sea. It's in the poetry, it's in the songs, it's in the media. And so nothing, no territorial compromise will ever be good enough, because everything that they hope for is in fact the removal of the Jewish people from our ancestral homeland. And so whatever Ambassador Hassassian says, yes, he's right about one thing. The core of this conflict is 48. The core of this conflict is the existence of Israel in whatever land borders you want to talk about.
Okay, so if you both agree that this is a highly historic conflict, goes back decades to the 1940s, as you say, something else you might agree on, and I'd like to put this to you, Ambassador Hassassian, is that the idea of a two-state solution, when you have a war raging in Gaza, a massive uptick in violence in the West Bank, is that a two-state solution is probably a more distant prospect than it's been at any time in living memory.
That was the ideology and the strategy of Mr. Netanyahu, to kill the entire Oslo peace process, and he managed to kill it. Because if you go back to the two-state solution, when we agreed and signed at the White House loan back in 1994, we have agreed that, there will be a withdrawal of the Israelis, basically from the occupied territories of the West Bank, Gaza and East Jerusalem. And by 1999, we could have declared our independent state, living side by side democratically with Israel. What happened? With the Oslo Agreement, when Netanyahu came to power in 1996, he started, the building of settlements. The number of settlers quadrupled, the number of settlements tripled, and we started seeing facts on the ground changing. And by the end, we have witnessed a failure in Camp David on the issue of right of return and the issue of the sovereignty on Jerusalem. And the Second Intifada broke out and hell broke loose. Sharon withdrew unilaterally in 2005 from Gaza, besieged it by land, air, and force. And this is where we ended now. The Palestinians have agreed, after so many years, the PLO, to accept political accommodation as the only plausible solution to this conflict. And we have signed the Oslo Accords, with the Israeli side. It's so unfortunate that Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated. He was a true and genuine, to my belief, as representing Israel and believing in ultimately the two-state solution. But when Netanyahu came with the extreme right-wing governments, following, this is a prime minister who has been there for 13 years with the same ideology. He's not budging 1 inch. And what is left today of the West Bank to talk about the two-state solutions? It became a land with Swiss cheese, no geographic contiguity whatsoever, no contours of this West Bank that could be, ceded to Gaza along with East Jerusalem, to have an independent Palestinian state that could be, really a genuine state, with all borders, with Israel controlled and monitored by the international community. We haven't seen these things developing, except, all the time putting the onus on the Palestinians that they refuse everything that they are given to them. Look, what are the Israelis giving to us now? A war, 41,000 people have been killed, 100,000 have been injured. And, the statistics, I don't need to go into that rhetoric because the international community have been seeing it, and it is widely on television. Where is the intention of this government in also trying to weaken the Palestinian Authority, the only pragmatic, authority that is willing to sit and negotiate a two-state deal with the state of Israel? They are withholding our tax revenues. They are weakening, the Palestinian Authority. They are creating, incidents on the ground in the West Bank in order to instigate, our security forces to be engaged with Israel. And this is what they want. They are letting the settlers, with the gun-ho mentality to attack, our villages and cities in the West Bank. After that, Netanyahu is willing also to escalate in the northern part of Palestine with Hezbollah and what have you. And this is, he wants the Americans to be engaged in a regional war. And this is the end result.
Okay.
It's destruction, lack of security. This is what is going to be encountered by the people in the Middle East. It's not only the Palestinians. The saga will continue to expand this regional conflict into something that will be beyond control of the international community, unfortunately.
Ambassador, you make lots of important points there. I'd like to pick up on this issue of the building of settlements and put that to Fleur. I mean, how do you reconcile the building of settlements with an eventual two-state solution? It does seem quite a difficult set of priorities to reconcile, doesn't it?
Well, I want to respond because it seems like the ambassador is a bit confused about dates. Because when Oslo was offered, it was Ehud Barak who was the prime minister, and it was Yasser Arafat who, instead of either renegotiating, he wasn't happy with the terms.
It was
I didn't interrupt you, Ambassador, so please have the courtesy to wait for me.
But it's wrong.
It was Ehud Barak.
In 2000.
I will not be interrupted. If you'd like me to talk, then I'll talk.
No, I don't want to interrupt you.
Ehud
I'm
Barak
just saying,
offered
the Oslo
Arafat
agreement was signed with
everything. He
Rabin.
said,
With Rabin,
Ehud
not
Barak, Ehud Barak in 2000 offered everything that the Palestinian leadership said it
That's
wanted.
something else.
Okay, no, it's the same because you keep blaming Netanyahu for everything, and I'm asking you why Yasser Arafat turned around and created a bloody second intifada that killed thousands of people in the streets of my city, in Jews and Arabs, after 2001, after the Oslo Accords. That was not killed by Netanyahu, it was killed by Yasser Arafat. And it's not me saying it, it's President Clinton saying it, who was there. And so you can't argue with that. And then in 2009, Ehud Olmert offered it once again. And this time it was Mahmoud Abbas who said no to a peaceful solution. So it's very easy. It's very easy to blame Netanyahu for everything. And it's much harder to take responsibility for mistakes and for throwing your people under the bus again and again and again.
All right, Fleur, let's let Ambassador Hassassian answer that. And then I really want to come back to you on that question about settlement. So go ahead, Ambassador.
Well, actually, two issues that went wrong in Camp David in the year 2000. One, the question of right of return was not accepted by Ehud Barak. And the second question is the question of sovereignty over Haram al-Sharif. Okay? These two issues were not accepted by Yasser Arafat. It was imposed, by of course, Ehud Barak. And the Americans, wanted really to sell this issue to Arafat, whom he couldn't, at that time, accept, these two issues to be part and parcel.
We could be celebrating 24 years of a Palestinian state right now. We could be celebrating 24 years of a Palestinian state right now.
Yeah.
And instead, look where we are.
This is you have said what you have said, and I'm trying to answer why the Palestinians have not accepted the conditions of Barak supported by the United States.
You don't start a bloody second intifada, so you renegotiate.
We could not agree on Camp David with the two issues that have been, imposed on us, and it was impossible because we don't have mandate to give Haram al-Sharif to you by 1.8 billion Muslims. You have to know that. And we cannot compromise our people that have been forcefully diasporized in 1948 by the right of return. So what do you want Arafat to do?
Or the
to concede
Temple
on
Mount
these
is
two
currently
issues
being run
and accept,
by the Jordanian Waqf.
a truncated
Currently
West
administered
Bank,
by the Jordanian
with
Waqf.
these two issues
right
not
now.
being, involved? Stop interrupting me, please. Listen to what I'm saying. You are not listening. You just want to push Netanyahu's agenda. We're trying to tell you that Netanyahu has been procrastinating and he has not been cooperative in negotiations. Tell me, did Netanyahu meet President Abbas in any of these meetings? And when Olmert met with President Abbas, we looked at the conditions. He was an ongoing exit prime minister who did not have the mandate really to go ahead with this formula with President Abbas. That's why it did not work out. He was not a prime minister who was entrenched in his position to make such a concession. It was something that was good to look into and to come out with an agreement. But what happened? Prime Minister Olmert left office. This is what happened. We're not criticizing what Olmert and President Abbas have agreed upon. It was something that could be a prelude towards a good understanding of achieving a two-state solution.
Okay, Fleur, Hassan-Nahoum, how do you respond to that?
Again, he hasn't explained to me why Arafat decided to start a bloody intifada instead of going back to the table and keep renegotiating. This is not a leadership that has ever really put its people and its interests of its people. There's always ways to come to compromises and arrangements. And to start a second intifada instead of renegotiating is, to me, Arafat was not a leader that actually really did want to bring a state for his people, and that's really the core of the conflict.
Let's return to the present day.
Because I don't believe this conflict is territorial. I don't believe this conflict is territorial.
Well, let me pick up on that. Let's return to the present day. I wanted to ask you, Fleur, I wanted to ask you about those comments made by Ambassador Hassassian a moment ago. He described the West Bank as being a Swiss cheese of isolated geographical patches that does not sound, does it, conducive to a future Palestinian state. How do you respond to that?
First of all, let's put the facts straight. According to Oslo, Judea and Samaria, as we call the West Bank, because it's our ancestral homeland, is divided into Area A, B, and C. The Palestinian Authority has autonomy over Area A and most autonomy over Area B. And what's really up for grabs, or what's really up for negotiations, is Area C. 94% of the Palestinian population live between areas A and B. And so what we're talking about is 6%, 8% of the Palestinian population in Area C. Now, I'm always, I think the majority of Israelis would be very happy for some type of territorial compromise if they actually thought it was going to bring us peace and people were not going to continue to be killed and massacred. But look at the precedents that we have. We left Gaza in 2005, and we have Hamas. We did Oslo, and we have terror cells coming out of the Palestinian territories. So really, what incentive is there for Israel to do any territorial compromises when all we're getting is more bloodshed and killing and terrorism?
Okay, let's go back to what's happening in the negotiations, just because we're about to come to the end. If you don't mind, we're close to the end of the program. I'd just like to kind of look forwards a little bit and start looking at what might be achieved diplomatically with regards to a resolution to the situation in Gaza. I think a lot of disappointment with the lack of results from the negotiations up until this point, probably on all sides. Ambassador, the Qataris and the Egyptians are brokering here, and we haven't got a ceasefire. We have only had one ceasefire since the conflict began 11 months ago. Do you think a change of negotiators might result in perhaps some new momentum coming into the diplomatic efforts?
Just before answering that, I just want to give a certain kind of an information which is important. 61% is Area C, totally controlled by Israel. 37% is the Area B, which is controlled by Israelis and Palestinians, and only 12%, which are the major cities, the 6 cities where Palestinians have full authority. I just wanted to make this remark. Concerning, the negotiations, I think there should be more involvement by the United Nations in these negotiations. It's not enough to have Qatar, Egypt, as mediators along with the United States. I think the United Nations should be an added factor to bring, the parties towards more achieving, a plausible solution. And, in negotiations, people start with maximalist position and they end up with optimal acceptance of the facts. So nobody should try to maximize in any kind of negotiations. Concessions should be made on both sides in order to reach an agreement. And in order to reach an agreement, we need, objective bystanders, to this issue, where, both parties that are negotiating should be controlled by the parameters that are put by the interlocutors to head in trying to bring the two parties to an agreement as soon as possible. Because, as you can see, hundreds of people are being killed and the incessant, genocide is continuing. So we don't want anybody to die anymore. It's enough. We need humanitarian assistance. We need to bring a halt to this war and try to see how we can negotiate the day after. This is what our wish is, basically. And we don't see it from the Israeli side. Sorry. Sure. I mean, all our sources that are telling us Netanyahu is not, he wants to flatten completely Gaza, the West Bank, and whatever. And then he might consider to get back to the negotiating, to get his hostages back.
Okay, Ambassador, I gave you the first word. I'd like to give Fleur the last word of this discussion. Could I just ask you to respond to what's been said and also just tell us where you see things heading to from here with regards to the diplomatic efforts?
I repeat, we didn't want this war. There's no genocide going on. This is Israel trying to defend itself and making sure that the terrorist that has made it part of its charter, the entire destruction, not just of the state of Israel, but of all the Jews around the world as part of their charter. We cannot let an enemy, which is an existential enemy, stay on its feet after a war we didn't start. We want our hostages home. We want peace. We've always wanted peace. Israel wants to exist in peace.
Yes,
We've
by
tried.
controlling
We've
others.
tried to have.
Yes,
we've
by
tried to
controlling the
have-
Palestinians.
Tried to have peace with the Palestinian leadership, and they haven't been brave enough to do one thing: just accept that Israel is here and it's not going away. The minute they accept, in everything, in the education system, in the liturgy, in the media, in everything, the minute they accept that we're not going away, that is the beginning for a long-lasting peace, and we all pray for that in Israel.
Okay. Former Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem and Special Envoy for Trade and Innovation, Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, you have had the last word. And thank you very much indeed to the Palestinian ambassador to Denmark, Manuel Hassassian. Thank you very much indeed for you. Coming up in just a moment, we'll have the latest from the US elections, and I'll be joined by the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense during the Obama administration, David Sedney. That's right after this.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversations.
If former US President Donald Trump wins back the White House, he's going to face an in-tray packed full of geopolitical challenges. So what could his America First agenda mean for foreign policy? And how might his running mate, J.D. Vance, sway or support Trump's approach during a second term in office? Our very own Benji Haya went to find out more.
The world has changed since Donald Trump first became commander-in-chief, with conflicts flaring in Europe and the Middle East. Yet the former president's nationalist foreign policy has largely remained the same, picking a like-minded running mate in Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, who now shares much of Trump's worldview. Take Ukraine. Donald Trump claims he'd be able to solve the conflict in a single day, but at what cost to the West? Both he and J.D. Vance have at points opposed further military aid to Kiev, and both have hit out at NATO allies for not paying their fair share of defence.
Yes, NATO is going to be stronger because of its own arms, because of its own investment. The question is that going to happen fast enough in case Trump says something so irresponsible that leads to testing of lines before Europe is so sufficiently armed that it can, in fact, defend every inch from the first moment?
J.D. Vance says the US needs to pivot its focus and budget should instead prioritise China as a way of defending America and its industry.
We will protect the wages of American workers and stop the Chinese Communist Party from building their middle class on the backs of American citizens.
Donald Trump promises to get tough on China, hinting he'd hit Chinese goods with tariffs in excess of 60%.
Sentiment around trade with China, just China in general in Washington these days, is very hawkish. And so I think you'd see a lot of support for this increase of tariffs.
Then there's the Middle East and the war in Gaza. Trump and Vance are staunchly pro-Israel, but they're also partial to a deal, best exemplified by the Abraham Accords back in 2020, Gulf and other states recognising the Jewish homeland for the first time.
And that strategy of striking deals on several fronts in a way, frankly, to favour American interest above all else, that could be a key feature of a Trump-Vance administration if they win the White House come November. Benji Haya, Al Arabiya English, Washington.
So in this, the first and perhaps only debate before the presidential election, China, the war in Gaza, the war in Ukraine and the exit from Afghanistan all came under discussion during that debate. For more, we're joined now by the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense during the Obama administration, David Sedney. A very warm welcome to you, David. And the chair of Republicans Overseas, Greg Swenson. Thank you very much indeed to both of you. Neither of the two candidates are unknown entities by any means. But before the debate, a lot of people have been saying they didn't feel like they knew Kamala Harris all that well. And when it comes to foreign policy, perhaps even less so. Do you feel like you got to know more about what she stands for with regards to foreign policy than you did before that debate? Let me put that to you, first of all, Greg.
Not really. I mean, I think she talked a lot in sort of banalities and taught, in platitudes, but not really specifics. So I think there's still a lot of mystery there. And I think she was very skillful at avoiding any, sort of specific or intense policy discussions. She kind of kicked everything back to President Trump, triggering, I think in many ways he took the bait, but it was a very skillful way to avoid policy. I don't think a lot of Americans, or undecideds anyway, know much more about Kamala Harris than they did 2 days ago.
Okay, David, what are your thoughts with regards to what more we found out about Harris? And also tell me what it would mean for foreign policy for the United States to have another Trump term.
Well, maybe I watched a different debate because I saw a very strong, tough, leadership capable Kamala Harris. The biggest difference, of course, was on Ukraine. Vice President Harris made clear that under her administration, we would continue to support Ukraine, continue to support President Zelensky, and continue to provide arms to the Ukrainians to repel the Russian invasion. President Trump, on the other hand, refused to really comment about anything except the sort of absurd comment that he would solve the problem before, as soon as he became president-elect. He'd sit down with the two and just get some kind of agreement. That, as I said, that's really absurd. He made a lot of absurd comments, and that was probably one of the wackiest ones. So that was a big difference on policy. Vice President Harris will continue to support Ukraine. Former President Trump will surrender to Putin. That's, I think, pretty clear. Another area where I think we saw some difference, important difference really, was on the issue of Gaza and Palestine. While both said they supported Israel, Vice President Harris made clear that she is concerned about the plight of the Palestinians. She wants to see greater humanitarian aid. She wants to see less Palestinians killed. While on the other hand, President Trump made clear that he supports Israel and doesn't really care about the Palestinians. So those are two major areas. I think on China, the two candidates are pretty close. And then finally, the area of support for alliances. President Trump made his sort of silly claim that while he was president, he got people to pay more for NATO. In fact, all countries did was they continued to pay what they had promised to pay under Obama. He didn't really get any more money. And played this idea that somehow people in NATO are getting a free ride. In fact, the NATO countries are supporting very heavily Ukraine, and that's an area where, again, Trump made a misstatement of fact. So I thought you saw a great deal of difference. But I also would say at the end, foreign policy is not something many Americans vote on. I agree that there are not that many undecideds, and foreign policy is unlikely to be a big issue. So I would say you saw some differences, but what difference that will make on Election Day, I think, is very questionable.
Sure. I'd like to ask you, Greg. I mean, Donald Trump made mention of Afghanistan and the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, which I think he said words to the effect that it was a disgrace for the United States. I just wonder what Donald Trump would have done different, what you think he'd have done differently, and indeed why he didn't do that different thing when he was the president.
Yeah, I'm not sure he would advocate for staying, because he was the one who made the announcement and decided to leave Afghanistan. But I think with Mike Pompeo in the seat as Secretary of State, they were very deliberate and very cautious about making sure that the Afghanis hit certain milestones that we all had to approve the different steps of the withdrawal. I'm sure they would not have just given up Bagram Air Force Base. I think the consensus is, again, both Trump and Biden wanted to get out of Afghanistan. There's two different ways to how to accomplish that. And here in the UK, there was a great suspicion of Biden after that botched withdrawal, because he wasn't taking Boris Johnson's phone call when Boris was prime minister. Clearly that was a disaster. And I think that's the consensus here in Europe, is that was just a horrible moment. And it's really established the Biden administration at least in perception here in Europe, as weak. And that's why one of the reasons we saw, Russia invade Ukraine and Hamas invade Israel. These were, sort of weak moments for America, besides the appeasement to Iran and sort of overall weak foreign policy or general appeasement, both with sanctions on Iran, as well as the assault on the American energy sector, which really helped Putin and the Saudis and Venezuela and Iran make considerable amounts of money with elevated oil prices. And then we found Jake Sullivan going to Moscow begging Putin to pump more oil. This is, of course, before the invasion of Ukraine. Going to Venezuela, asking them to pump more, and going to Saudi, and Biden went to Saudi, to Riyadh, and begged MBS to pump more oil. These are things that, in addition to foreign policy, the assault on the American energy sector has surely not helped our position in the world over the last 3.5 years.
Just picking up on what Greg was saying there, David, I mean, to what extent would you say that what he described there as a botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, and Donald Trump said something similar. In fact, a lot of people said something quite similar. How damaging do you think that was to the Biden administration's sort of overall perception and brand viewed from the outside?
It was very damaging. It was certainly the low point of the Biden presidency. And but there's no evidence that President Trump would have done any better. In fact, as Vice President Harris pointed out in the debate, the problem here was the surrender agreement that President Trump agreed to, and his, again, rather silly, absurd idea of inviting the Taliban to Camp David, which is really a ridiculous bestowal of status upon the Taliban. It was a horrible agreement that President Trump approved. Secretary of State Pompeo did a lousy job. The actual agreement was negotiated by their special envoy, Zalmay Khalilzad, who is now, I think, roundly condemned by people throughout the Afghan world as having done a horrible disservice to the Afghan people. So the basis for all the disaster of the August 2021 was the even worse surrender agreement signed off on by President Trump and by Secretary of State Pompeo. So there's a lot of blame to go around, and I think the statement that led to a perception of weakness on the part of the United States is probably true. But what this administration has done since then, with the very active efforts of Vice President Harris, who has visited Ukraine, I think 5 times, or met Zelensky 5 times, and has been very clear of her strong support, that has reversed that. No longer do Russia and China worry about the United States not supporting its friends and allies. Now they see us doing a very aggressive job of working to make sure that Russian aggression is stopped in Ukraine and doesn't spread to Europe and beyond. Americans don't want to have Russian troops invading the U.S., but that's the path former President Trump would set us on by his weakness in dealing with Putin.
Yeah, I just want to ask you, Greg, with regards to America's allies around the world. I mean, I think some of them have almost made no secret of the fact that they don't relish the idea of another Trump term in office. Interesting that Donald Trump singled out Hungary as being a key backer and a key ally of him during that debate. But I'm just thinking to myself, of all the world leaders he could have chosen, why do you think he chose the leader of a relatively small Eastern European country with a population of just 9 million? Couldn't he have found a stronger endorsement?
I think so. I totally agree with you, Tom. And I thought that was a mistake of all the leaders in the world. It doesn't mean I'm condemning, the Hungarian leader, Orban, but that was probably a misstep. I thought, President Trump had several missteps during the debate. That was perhaps one of them. But I think that if you look at the way Trump handled our allies and our friends when he was president, he might have said clumsy things, and I think many diplomats around the world find his delivery, sometimes, shall we say, unfiltered, and that makes people uncomfortable. But on the other hand, if you look at what he actually did, he did insist, and there was response, and the diplomatic crowd here in Europe, especially in the UK, they actually appreciate that he pushed the allies or the NATO allies to spend more on defense and hit their 2% targets. Yes, Obama might have had those targets or knew of those targets, but Trump is the one who went, especially in Germany in 2018, really shook the tree. And a lot of diplomats here they might not like his tone, but they appreciate that now 21 countries in NATO are hitting the 2% targets. The challenge is that France, the biggest economies besides the UK, France, Germany, Spain, they are not hitting those targets. They are anemically low. And so that's a challenge. But I also think that President Trump did a fantastic job in the Middle East in terms of supporting our friends and allies and demonstrating some strength against Iran with the sanctions on oil exports for Iran. I think that was well appreciated by the Arab countries as well as Israel. So that worked. The Arab Accords actually worked. So I think the perception of Trump from many around the world is that he is unfiltered, makes things uncomfortable, but in terms of the results and the outcomes, they might not miss Trump, but they miss peace and prosperity from his administration, and they now are in a much more dangerous world.
Yeah, and Greg, actually in Japan, they had a foreign minister some years back by the name of Toshimitsu Motegi, and they dubbed him the Trump Whisperer. It suggests there's an art to dealing with Donald Trump if you're a foreign leader or a foreign diplomat. What is that art?
I think it's just being honest with him. You know, there's so much. I don't think he's good. He's not a politician. You know, he's not good at these diplomatic languages and you know, beating around the bush and going through formalities. And sometimes that hurts him. You know, I know on his state visit here to the UK, he really embraced it. He really loved it. He had a great relationship with the Queen, but a great relationship with the government here, the Tories. The problem is, in other instances, you know, he tends to make people feel really uncomfortable. He did that in Germany, but ultimately he was right. He was right about German dependence on natural gas from Russia. He was very, very critical in the buildup in Ukraine. He was the first president in the last few generations to send lethal weapons to Ukraine. He sent the Javelin missiles, for example, while Obama and Biden were sending non-lethal weapons or non-lethal material, you know, to an airbase in Poland because they didn't want to offend Putin. They were shipping it in commercial trucks from the U.S. airbase in Poland down to Kyiv. You know, Trump got in and started sending lethal material. So he's not one to surrender to Putin. He's been very, very aggressive. He put sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline while shutting down pipelines in the United States. So I think a lot of our partners miss the strength of Trump and the fact that he was supporting the allies. And look, he's not going to say the right things all the time, but they missed the peace and prosperity of 2019, that's for sure.
David, which of America's allies do you think are perhaps least relishing the idea that Donald Trump might come back into the White House?
Say all the countries where democracy, freedom, elections, any leader of a country like that is really concerned about the appearance of Donald Trump. The country leaders that like him, like Mr. Orban, are authoritarian or proto-authoritarian leaders. They're the ones that they like. Kim Jong-un is another one of Trump's buddies. Trump likes people who are authoritarian. He likes people who don't have to face elections. He likes people who are abusive to those who disagree with him in their own internal areas. And he doesn't like countries where people are freely elected. And he's made that clear over and over again. I do need to correct a couple of misstatements by my counterpart here. According to the latest statistics, I'm looking at them right now. Germany spends 2.12% of its GDP on defense. So he said German spending remains anemic. It's actually over the 2%. And since I was part of the Obama administration, I can tell you we worked very hard to get those countries to go up to 2% and over. And we had a plan agreed with those countries to get them over 2%. They followed through on their commitments to President Obama. Additional monies were not gotten by Trump. That is a false statement. Yes, additional monies were spent, but those were already planned before Trump was elected. So he didn't get any more. He just got what Obama had already gotten, already been promised to Obama. So NATO countries, most importantly, are afraid that Trump will surrender to Putin. And he made it pretty clear in the debate that he was prepared to surrender to Putin. And NATO countries don't want Russian troops moving into Ukraine, moving closer to their borders. They don't want Ukraine to be the first domino that falls, with the Baltics next and the Eastern European countries taken over. Again, you have to remember that President Putin is one who has said that the demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy in the history of the world. He believes that a reconstituted Soviet Union with dominance over Eastern Europe and holding Western Europe in its thrall through its threat of conventional forces and nuclear forces, that's what Putin wants. And that's what President Trump is prepared to accept. He's prepared to pull out of our Japanese and Korean alliances and give that part of the world to China. President Trump is weak on national defense. He's weak on national security, and people see him as weak. And finally, President Trump is a politician and has been a politician. I think this is his fourth or fifth run for the presidency. He is nothing but a politician. The statement that he's not a politician is made because people don't like the word politician, but President Trump is a real politician. Vice President Harris is a prosecutor, and she prosecuted former President Trump, and he crumbled in the face of her attack for strong positions in the debate, just as he crumbles whenever he meets anybody strong. President Trump is weak, and everybody knows it.
And Greg, let me turn to you. I mean, feel free to pick up on any of those points. I'd also like to specifically put to you the point that emerged subsequent to the debate, that in fact what Donald Trump said about a single telephone call to the Kremlin fixing the situation in Ukraine wasn't actually true. They said it wouldn't be fixed with a telephone call. Do you think perhaps Donald Trump has rather overestimated the extent of his influence on President Putin and the degree to which they actually have a working friendship / relationship?
Well, I mean, the argument, you sometimes have to keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. But look, Trump is not afraid to engage with our adversaries. That's the case, I think, with all good presidents. You must, you have the phone next, to the phone to the Kremlin. But I think that he gets along very well with many democracies, maybe not everybody. I don't think Justin Trudeau will be, Trump's best friend, and he's an authoritarian. So, I don't think it's just the authoritarians that get along with Trump because again, Biden seems to be quite chummy with Justin Trudeau. So, but here in the UK, especially when the Conservatives were in power, which is only until a few months ago, there was a great working relationship with Trump in those years. Not to say that it wasn't decent with Biden, but there surely was a little scar tissue for some of the snubs that Biden had for the United Kingdom. And again, Trump had a great relationship here in the UK, which is not an authoritarian government and is a very robust democracy. So the perception here in Western Europe of Trump, again, is maybe he's not a great diplomat, but at least in terms of his manners, but his accomplishments have been good. To say that he's weak and would roll over and give up our alliances with Japan, it's just not true. Look, he left the world a peaceful place in 2020, and I imagine his policies would be the same. I can't tell you how he's going to fix Ukraine and Russia in 24 hours. That seems to be a bit of hyperbole, to say the least. But he was tough on Putin with Nord Stream 2 sanctions. Of course, Biden lifted those sanctions when he got in, just like he lifted the embargo on Iran. And then flipped again and put the sanctions back on Nord Stream after Putin invaded Ukraine. So I don't think it's fair to say that Trump is weak on foreign policy. He's actually quite strong. And the world, like I said, the world misses the peace that he had in 2020. I can surely say that about the Middle East, and I could probably say the same about Russia and Ukraine. Does he exaggerate a little and say Putin never would have invaded? Maybe, but Putin invaded countries in 2008 and 2014 and 2022, none from 2017 to early 21.
And David, just turning back to you, I mean, with regards to developments in the Middle East, specifically in Gaza, we're 11 months into a horrible war there, a humanitarian catastrophe. And despite all these diplomatic efforts by these various different players, something which is quite a recurrent theme in our show this evening is that despite all these efforts, in which the United States is playing a leading role under the Biden administration, there hasn't been an awful lot to show for those diplomatic efforts, certainly not since November last year when there was a brief ceasefire. Wouldn't it therefore stand to reason for people in this part of the world to think that perhaps a change of administration in Washington might actually be the best hope at this stage of some sort of a solution to that situation?
Well, I actually don't think that the administration in Washington is the determinative factor for peace between Israel and Hamas. I think those dynamics are very much endemic to the region. Obviously, a long historical background there, and then continuing abuses and tragedies on all sides there that really make people dig in. The role of the United States in trying to bring peace has been episodic over the last 70 years. It's had some successes, but a lot more failures. So I don't think a change of administration, and I don't think there's probably people I speak to in the Middle East area don't really think that there's going to be much difference depending on who is elected. Vice President Harris had a tough job with her own party in the debate. She had to both reassure Jewish Americans who overwhelmingly support her that she was committed to the defense of Israel. She did that. But she also had to speak to the increasing numbers of especially young progressive Americans who see the problems, see the tragedies that are happening to the Palestinian people. I think she did that very adroitly, but I think that was really for a domestic audience as to how that would play out on the ground between Israel and Hamas. I don't think would have much difference. I wish I could be more optimistic about either administration resolving that problem, but based on the last 70 plus years, I really can't be optimistic at all. We can be hopeful, but I don't think it's logical to be optimistic.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed for your time today. David Sedney, you have had the last word. A very big thank you as well to Greg Swenson, the chair of Republicans Overseas. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thanks a lot, Tom.
Thank you all.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
They've got to have a vote and a say.
it's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers,
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Welcome back. We are now 54 days away from Election Day in the United States, and the first ballots are already going out in some states for early voting. Well, 2 days on from the presidential debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, what has changed with regards to how the race for the White House is shaping up? Well, for more on this, I'm joined by our correspondent in D.C., Caroline Malone. Welcome to the program, Caroline. 67 million people watched the first Harris-Trump debate, blowing past the Biden matchup. Now that the dust has settled a little bit, what more conclusions are being drawn by the press and the pundits and the general public as well as to who came out stronger in that debate?
Well, a huge number of people watch this debate, and it does show the level of engagement that people have less than 2 months now until the election. As you point out, there were fewer people that watched the Biden-Trump debate, and we know how that turned out, hugely pivotal in this election cycle. However, less people that ended up watching, it was about 84 million that ended up watching the Hillary Clinton-Trump debate back in 2016. At the time, Clinton was touted as winning that debate, but she went on to lose the election. However, this time around, it's Harris that seems to be out on top. Pundits, polls, people that have been reviewed, surveys all showing that they view Kamala Harris as doing a better job in this debate. Having said that, Trump came out afterwards in the spin room and said that he thought he won the debate. He also said he thought he had a harder time because he was debating 3 people. By that, he meant the ABC moderators as well as Kamala Harris. Now, to be fair to him, he was fact-checked a lot by the moderators of ABC. Some might argue that he needed to be fact-checked more than Harris did, but certainly it did seem that they were giving him a harder time than they were Harris. You know, having said all that, though, it does seem like Harris has come out on top here. The big question is, will that translate into more votes for her?
Yeah, I was going to say, we're just 2 months away, aren't we? Less than 2 months away from Election Day. And I'm just interested to know more about what sort of an impact a debate like Tuesday's could potentially have on the polls, or is already having on opinion polls?
Well, absolutely. Traditionally, debates don't move the opinion polls that much. But this year has been unprecedented in so many ways, not least of which what we saw happen after the Biden debate that was so disastrous for him that he ended up saying he wouldn't run again. And now, of course, we have Harris. So things could be impactful in a way that we haven't seen before. In terms of the polls themselves, Harris has been on very much an upward trend for the last few months since she's been part of the campaign, to the point now where she is neck and neck with Trump in nationwide polls. However, even more important than that is how she's doing in swing states. So in the US, the votes on a state basis are in some ways even more important than the national polls, because it's state by state that each presidential candidate gets to a number of electoral college votes that then go towards them winning or losing the presidency. And in these swing states, Harris has gained so much that she's in fact winning fractionally by 1 to 3 percentage points in a number of those swing states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania being among the important ones. Trump's still looking like he's ahead, or at least on par with Harris in places such as Nevada, which is very important, North Carolina. Having said that, those percentages are all within the margin of error, and it is still, less than 2 months now until the election. So things could go either way. I think what's also important to note, though, is the amount of fundraising that both candidates have been able to do. Harris, up until this point, has raised more than $500 million. That is record-breaking amounts in these crucial last few months until the election in November. And that's the kind of money that the Democrats are able to use to gain grassroots support, to get potentially new voters out to vote, to get people that might be, on the sidelines or undecided about how they might vote, to use that money towards those campaigning in swing states in particular. And lots of strategists I've been speaking to have spoken about some quite smart strategies that the Democrats have at the moment. One of which is to have Harris continuing to campaign in some of the states that they actually don't think she might win. Among them, we've got her in North Carolina at the end of this week. That's an important state that does often go to the Republicans and so may go towards Trump. But they're doing that because they think it might distract from the Trump campaign from putting all their efforts into the states they think they're going to win. So Harris really might need to focus more efforts in the future into Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. But certainly important to see which way the polls are going, because that gives us an indication of how things might end up in November.
Just looking forwards to January, the 6th of January in particular, a key date in modern US history. And the 6th of January 2025 is going to be a particularly important date because it'll be the first change of administration since 2021. And we know what happened on the 6th of January 2021. So I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that every possible step is going to be taken to prevent a repeat of what happened nearly 4 years ago.
Well, absolutely. Hugely important date. And in fact, so important that the Secret Service have already designated it a special national security event. What that means is it elevates it up to the level of a presidential inauguration event or a campaign event, such as a convention for the Democrats or Republicans. That releases a number of funds and really focuses efforts by the security forces on making sure that that date remains secure. Now, the Secret Service are also coordinating on a federal level with agencies, also local enforcement, Capitol Police being among the groups of officials and security that are going to be focusing on keeping things secure for that date so that there isn't a repeat of what happened in 2021. There are now more Capitol Police officers than there were a few years ago. That's something that's been very important for Washington, D.C. They've had a recruitment drive because they recognize how important it is to have those officers on the street. And we've seen at recent major events, such as when Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was visiting a few weeks ago and there were protests, a huge presence of security officials on the streets. Pretty much every corner where I was watching and covering the protests around Capitol Hill, around Congress, as well as huge fencing that was put up around all the roads in the area. And that fencing, wasn't there in 2021. That's something that people have noticed, and we are like to see an increased level of fencing to protect Congress itself, because the security officials aren't just protecting the building, of course, they're also protecting the lawmakers who are inside. Now, talking of the lawmakers, there is, one other thing that could complicate efforts. That is, lawmakers continue to debate on funding, including for security officials. There's been a lot of back and forth in recent weeks because Republicans, Democrats can't seem to agree on how to push forward government funding. There's the potential of a shutdown even in October. That's been very difficult for House Speaker Mike Johnson to push forward and get a vote on because he knows he hasn't got consensus so far. And that's the type of level of consensus that you need to release funding for security. So that could be an added level of complication looking forward to these important security events.
OK, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Our correspondent Caroline Malone in Washington. Thank you very much to you. And that is all we have time for on Global News today. Be sure to join us again tomorrow, same time, same place. Thanks for watching.